types of documents were created, have you?
I've not seen any testimony, no.
And what you refer to in your report is 3 documents. Is that correct?
It was several. I don't recall if it was specifically 3.
Okay, I will help you with that. Okay, I will come back to it. So you haven't seen, actually I have a note here that may help me. Look at paragraph 14, page 8 of your written direct. The second sentence from the bottom of that page says, I reviewed 3 documents prepared by Apple's corporate FP&A group that contain profitability analyses specific to the App Store. Do you see that language, sir?
I'm still trying to get there. I'm sorry.
Okay. Tell me when you're ready.
I see there's a reference here to 3. I don't know if that's all the documents I reviewed.
But you do know that that statement is true, that you reviewed 3 documents prepared by Apple's corporate FP&A group that contain profitability analyses specific to the App Store. That is true, isn't it not?
True, the documents that contain profitability of the App Store, yes.
Okay. And then if you look at paragraph 15 on the next page, there's a statement, these documents confirm my conclusions. Do you see that, sir?
I see that.
So those 3 documents confirm your conclusion. Is that right, sir?
Again, I don't necessarily agree that...
Can you answer my question, sir? I'm not asking about what you agree with. Did those 3 documents that you reference in your report confirm your conclusions?
As asked, I don't know.
You don't know. But you do know that the statements in your written direct are correct, are true. You know that.
Yes, I think you may be
I didn't ask you for your thoughts, sir. Ethics Counsel will give you every opportunity to share any thoughts they think are germane to your testimony. Now, you don't know how the documents were used. You don't know how often these types of documents were prepared. Are both of those correct, sir?
I don't necessarily agree with that statement.
I am talking to you, sir, about the 3 documents that confirm your conclusions. Are you with me?
Yes.
Okay. And have you seen any testimony about those 3 documents?
Testimony, no.
And that's what I was asking you. Have you seen any testimony explaining how those 3 documents, and you have seen no testimony explaining who actually reviewed those documents or for what purpose?
Not testimony.
And you have not seen any testimony explaining whether the margins reflected in those documents had been prepared on a fully burdened basis, the type of testimony that you saw from Mr. Rollins with respect to the other documents we talked about earlier.
I haven't seen testimony on that.
And if an Apple witness was to testify that these 3 documents that confirm your conclusions did not reflect a fully burdened allocation of costs, you would have to accept that it's true. just as you did for Mr. Rollins' testimony, would you not, sir?
No, that would be incorrect.
Oh, so you are assessing the credibility of Apple witnesses?
I'm not assessing the credibility, but that statement would be incorrect.
And you believe that you would be able, you, Mr. Barnes, would be able to determine with no testimony that these three documents, that they had been developed on a fully burdened basis. Is that your testimony, sir?
I have done that.
You have done that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So you have done a assessment that allows you to determine which costs in Apple are properly allocated to the App Store.
I have been able to... Well,
answer my question, sir. Have you, Mr. Barnes, done an assessment of which costs at Apple are properly allocated to the App Store?
I believe so, yes.
You believe you have?
Yes.
And can you point me to where you have given that opinion here in your report? Have you ever worked at Apple, sir?
Do you want me to answer the first question?
Yes. Actually, withdraw that. Let me ask you a second. Have you ever worked at Apple?
I've never been employed at Apple now.
Do you know the level of cost that Apple incurs for research and development?
Generally, yes.
And do you know how those costs benefit its different business segments?
I know how Apple treats them, yes.
I asked you what you knew, sir. You feel like you know. You have told us that you have done a calculation that shows that the allocations in these three newly produced documents are in fact correct. Isn't that the testimony you gave us?
That's a different question than you asked me, but I've been able to determine that they're on a fully burdened basis.
So let me ask you a different question, and sir, perhaps I wasn't clear. Have you done any assessment that would enable you to opine to this court under oath that all of the costs attributable to the App Store have been properly allocated to the App Store in these newly produced documents?
I don't know specifically.
Answer my question, sir. Do you need it back?
No, I'm trying to answer it, actually. I don't know. The question as you've asked it, I don't know.
So you haven't done that assessment, right? And you can't do that assessment, right?
I don't have access to the underlying detail that backs up these data.
Thank you, sir. Now let's talk about your online marketplaces work. You were asked by Dr. David Evans, another ethics expert, to identify certain businesses that operate online marketplaces. Is that right, sir?
To identify them and report on operating margins if available.
And Dr. Evans gave you the definition of online marketplaces to use. Is that correct?
He did.
And I think I heard you explain in your direct testimony that you felt it was important to identify online marketplaces that use what you refer to as net basis accounting. Is that correct, sir?
That's correct for their online marketplace activities.
Good. And companies that actually take title to goods and resell them are using a different kind of accounting. What did you refer to it as, sir?
That's called gross revenue recognition on a gross basis.
And Dr. Evans gave you some criteria, and you identified 5 companies: eBay, Etsy, Alibaba, Mercado Libre, and Rakuten. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Are those the 5 you identified?
Yes, I believe it's Rakuten. The only caveat I would give you is 2 of them I identified individual segments within those companies.
But you did not make any effort to ensure that the companies you identified were comparable to the App Store. Is that right, sir?
Comparable in what sense?
Comparable in the sense that term was used in your deposition testimony, sir.
Comparability in terms of the nature of the business was not within the scope of my work. I was only trying to ensure that there was a consistency of accounting.
You did not, sir, conduct a search for online marketplaces that are comparable to the App Store. Is that right?
That's true.
So you instead calculated operating margins for companies using a definition that Dr. Evans gave you. Is that right?
Dr. Evans provided you with the parameters, the initial parameters, yes.
And you used those parameters to identify the company.
Correct.
You did not conduct a search for comparable online marketplaces.
I was not trying.
Yes or no, sir? Did you conduct a search for comparable online marketplaces?
That was not part of my analysis, no.
Does that mean no?
Correct.
No. Okay. And that means you did not calculate operating margins for companies that facilitate transactions for apps or in-app purchases. Is that right, sir?
That's true. That was not a criteria.
So you did not attempt to calculate an operating margin for the Google Play Store. Is that right?
My recollection is that Alphabet was one of the companies that I did look at, but that their Google stores did not have sufficiently separable information.
And my question again was, did you calculate an operating margin for the Google Play Store? Not that you tried, did you do so?
Oh, I did not, no.
Did you calculate an operating margin for the Sony PlayStation Store?
No, I did not.
Did you calculate an operating margin for the Microsoft Store?
I did not.
Did you calculate an operating margin for the Samsung Galaxy Store?
I did not.
And did you calculate an operating margin for Nintendo eShop?
I did not.
And each of those companies actually facilitate app and in-app transactions. Isn't that correct, sir?
That's not something.
If you don't know, it's fine. Do you know?
I don't know. As I said here today, it sounds like that's something they would do, but that's not something I studied.
You don't know, one way or the other.
I haven't studied it.
Okay. And the reason you did not calculate operating margins for their brother stores is because they don't report separate financial results for their App Store activities, just like Apple does not. Isn't that correct, sir?
One of the criteria for selecting an online marketplace for me was that
I did not ask you what your criteria were for selecting an online marketplace. Let me ask you the question again. The reason you did not calculate an operating margin for Google Play Store, Sony PlayStation Store, Microsoft Store, Samsung Galaxy Store, and Nintendo eShop is because those companies do not report separate financial results for their App Store activities, just as Apple does not. Is that correct?
I'm struggling with the last part of that question. I don't know what the importance of the last little.
I didn't ask you how you felt about the question, sir. I'm trying to get your factual testimony here. Why don't we do it this way? Let's look at your written direct. Let's look at page 13, paragraph 24. Please read paragraph 24, sir.
Sure. A number of firms with operations that facilitate transactions for apps or in-app purchases, including the Google Play Store, Sony PlayStation Store, Microsoft Store, Samsung Galaxy Store, and Nintendo eShop, do not meet the criteria because they do not report sufficiently separate financial results for their App Store activities.
And that was truthful, sir, isn't it?
That is.
That is truthful.
Correct.
And Apple also does not report separate financial results for its Apple App Store. Isn't that correct?
Not publicly.
Yes. Are you aware, sir, that Apple operates a hardware business in addition to the App Store?
Yes.
Does eBay operate a hardware business?
I don't believe so.
Does Etsy, another of the companies that you calculated margins for, does it operate a hardware business?
I don't believe so.
What about the remaining three? Alibaba, Mercado Libre, and Rakuten. Hope I got it right that time. Do they operate a hardware business?
I don't think so. I would probably need to go back and double check on Rakuten, but I don't think so.
And, sir, is it correct that you are not offering an opinion on the comparability of any of the other firms that you did these operating margins for? That's eBay, Etsy, Alibaba, Mercado Libre, and Rakuten.
That's true.
Thank you, Professor Whitney.
Mr. Barnes, I'd like to speak first about what Ms. Moy described as the lack of testimony about the documents you obtained later. Do you know why there's a lack of testimony about those documents in the record so far?
My understanding is they were produced to Epic on the last day of discovery in this case.
I'd also like to talk about the documents themselves, very general level without getting into any detail. Was there information in these documents that you used to consider for what purpose they were prepared by Apple?
Yes.
I'd like to refer you to PX2391. We can start on the first page and probably end on the first page too.
This, Your Honor, is a document that is under seal. Okay, yeah, be careful.
2391.
I'm there.
And I only want to ask you the very general question of whether this page contains information relevant to any investigation of whether this document was used for business purposes.
Yes, it does.
Ms. Moya also asked you whether you had information about the ways in which expenses such as R&D were allocated. Do you remember that?
I do.
Is there information in these documents that allowed you to consider the way in which Apple allocated expenses such as R&D?
Yes, there was, both allocation and just attribution for direct R&D.
Thank you for that clarification. Could you please look at, again, we're going to talk about it very generally, PX2385.
Okay, I'm there.
And if you could please turn to page 24, that's 2835.24, which is actually 19 in the presentation. Apologies.
And again, just for the record, 2385 has also been sealed by the court in prior rulings. All right, good question.
Understood. Thank you, Your Honor. I only want to ask whether this page depicts the ways in which Apple allocates both direct, shared, I'm sorry, I'll withdraw that. I only want to ask whether this page depicts the way in which Apple assigns costs, whether they be direct, shared, or allocated costs across its line of business.
Objection, foundation. Well, let's do it. There is a lack of foundation, but you can ask him an open-ended question.
Thank you, Your Honor. What does this page depict from an accounting perspective and based on your experience as an accountant and a forensic accountant?
Well, how about, what did he use? Did he use this page? Let's start there.
Mr. Barnes, did you use this page in forming your opinions?
I did.
And how did you use this page in forming your opinions?
Again, generically.
This was one of a number of pages that was indicative that Apple was employing a rigorous analytic method to determine how costs could be either identified to specific business units or allocated if they were shared across multiple business units. And
That's what it meant to you.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, go ahead.
And because it may not be clear, is there a category on the right-hand side, without getting into any details, that would include the Apple App Store based on your investigation of these documents?
Yes.
Objection again, Foundation. Did you, well, tell me what, because you don't have Foundation, all that is relevant is what it is that you understood it to be for yourself, because you're not, there is no testimony, and you're not an Apple employee. So that's all you can really say.
If I could ask a clarifying question, Your Honor.
Okay?
Were you able in your investigation to determine in which of these categories on the right-hand side would have included the Apple App Store?
Yes, I was.
And how were you able to do that?
Because this document, which shows the allocation of costs, has figures on the right-hand side that go into different product and service line buckets. And I was able to reconcile those internally with other pages of this presentation to ascertain with a very high confidence level where the App Store's cost allocations are flowing.
And Mr. Barnes, if you could please direct the court to one of those other pages.
So I would direct the court to the pages that end in .11 and .12.
And let's start with 12, and maybe we can end there. What information does this page depict at a very high level of generality?
So for the fiscal year 20, which is a forecast period, this shows the breakdown of Apple's services lines of businesses between revenue, gross margin, operating expenses, and operating margin.
And how were you able to use this information to determine in which category on the other page of the App Store would be included in?
Without referring to specific numbers, I was able to tie out boxes that refer to operating expenses for services in this page to the flow chart that appears on the page ending in .24 for one of the categories that's showing the allocation of expenses.
And for the non-accountants in the room, could you please explain how you tie something out?
Tying something out is just simply an accountant's term for taking two sets of data, adding up the numbers and getting them to agree, which gives you confidence that you've accounted for everything.
And you said 2385.11 and 2385.12?
Yes, and I think, Your Honor, you can actually just use .12 to do what I need to do.
And is that because page 12 is services?
Yes, page 12 is services, so we can short circuit having to go through the products.
Thank you. You can put that away. Ms. Moyer referred to a series of testimony given by Mr. Sweeney regarding ethics practices Does that affect your opinion with respect to what Apple has done or is capable of doing?
No, it has no effect.
And why is that?
Well, as I testified, I wasn't investigating how Epic does its internal reporting, but I was investigating Apple's internal reporting of the Apple App Store, and I was able to determine, based on documents I reviewed, that both I was able to do my own estimate based in combination with the testimony of Mr. Rollins, but perhaps more importantly, I was able to verify that Apple does this internally in the ordinary course of business.
And just to make the record clear, did you perform any additional estimates or calculations with respect to the later produced documents that we were just looking at?
I did not do any adjustment to those documents.
Pass the witness, Your Honor.
No further questions? Going to dot 24. I take it you were looking at the iPhone number?
No, Your Honor. I was looking at the last item on the right-hand corner.
Okay.
And I can clarify what I mean by that.
Your Honor, may we read the name of just the category into the record just for clarity?
I think it's pretty obvious on the document.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor.
No, I'll have to go back and look at your math in your report. Thank you. Anything else? No, Your Honor.
No, Your Honor.
All right, you may step down. Next witness.
Good morning, Lauren Moskowitz for Epic Games. Epic calls Peter Rossi.
Oh, okay. All right, just make a little room. Is that okay? I do. Yes, my full name is Peter Eric Rossi, and my last name is spelled R-O-S-S-I.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
You may proceed, Ms. Moskowitz.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I approach with some binders? Good morning, Professor Rossi.
Good morning.
Have you prepared a written direct testimony for today?
Yes, I have.
If you could turn to your binder in the beginning there, can you confirm that that is your written direct testimony?
Yes, it is.
Your Honor, I offer Exhibit Expert 3, Professor Rossi's written direct into evidence.
Right, and are we still dealing with any sealing issues at all?
One redacted sentence in that will be subject to a motion to seal.
And is it agreed upon?
That's agreed upon, yes, Your Honor.
What sentence?
It is on the bottom of page, I believe, 13 and 14. I'm just going to confirm that. It's highlighted in your binder, and I just need to find it.
My binder doesn't have page numbers. You have a paragraph number?
49, Your Honor. Starts, for example, on the bottom.
Okay, I'll approve that. So I don't need an extra motion on that topic, and it's admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Your Honor, just one other administrative matter in connection with Professor Rossi. There are a number of documents that are included in this binder that the parties weren't able to get a stipulation done in time. If I could read those in and move for their admission at once, if that would be amenable to Your Honor.
So that's fine.
There's PX 2545, which is a flash drive of the actual survey results. PX 2547, PX 1085, which is subject to a motion to seal and contains some of the same data that was referred to in that sentence that Your Honor just read. PX 1086, PX 1087, PX 1088, PX 1089, PX 1090, PX 1091, and PX 1092. I move those into evidence, Your Honor.
Ms. Moran, no objection to that, Your Honor. We do just note there's a redaction issue with respect to PX 1085. Column C will need to be redacted as that document, but I think the parties have reached agreement on that.
Okay. This is I'm looking at it now, and it's not highlighted on my version. Is it just the third column?
It is, Your Honor. It's column C, the caption there, and the numbers underneath it.
Okay. That's sealed, and with that sealing, the exhibits are admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. Professor Rossi, can you just briefly summarize your background and qualifications for the court?
Yes, I teach at UCLA, and I do research and teach in the areas of survey methodology, statistics, marketing, and economics. And I've been doing that for about 35 years.
And even though Your Honor told us we didn't have to, I don't want to be the odd one out and not do it. Your Honor, I tender Professor Rossi in the field of, as an expert in the field of survey methodology and statistics for this matter.
No objection.
He's admitted.
Professor Rossi, did you prepare a set of demonstratives for your testimony today?
Yes, I did.
For the record, PDX 0091 for identification will be used. PDX 0091. Professor Rossi, what was your assignment in this case?
My assignment was to consider undertaking a survey to measure the reactions of consumers to a 5% increase across the board in a certain class of products on the Apple iStore, in-app purchases and subscriptions, which I refer to as at-issue purchases in my report.
And what did you conclude?
I concluded that it would be possible to undertake such a survey, but it would require the use of a hypothetical scenario, and that would follow in a long tradition of using hypotheticals successfully in surveys, both in commercial and litigation applications. But the real challenge would be to design a survey that would yield reliable data.
Why is a hypothetical appropriate here?
Because there does not exist marketplace transactional data that could be used to answer this question of what would happen in across-the-board price increase over a large number of products.
How did you go about designing the hypothetical scenario in this case?
Well, on this slide, I display the process. And the process really is to respond to the challenge of creating a scenario that can be expressed to respondents in a meaningful way. And that starts with qualitative research. That is, before we even draft a questionnaire, we undertake qualitative research and we go through a sequence of pre-testing. During that process, I came to realize that the best way that I know to make this hypothetical meaningful to respondents would be to ground it in their actual purchase experience on the App Store. So in order to do that, we ask respondents to go into the Apple App Store app, go to the purchase history feature, and actually enter the relevant transactions from that history into the survey, collect them as part of the survey. And having done that, we realized that we needed a test, if you will. We call it a reliability test, to ensure that they are reliably and conscientiously entering that data. And we devised a test in which we asked them to undertake a similar task on their iOS device, could be a phone or an iPad, in which they would go and look up what's called the model number. So, for example, an iPhone 7 is not a model number, it's a model name. Most people don't know, including myself, before the survey didn't know the model number. So we asked them to complete that test, and we terminated any respondent who did not successfully pass that test.
And you said that you collected actual purchase data from your respondents. Over what period of time did you ask those respondents to report their at-issue purchases?
Over a 30-day period.
And why did you pick that period?
For two basic reasons. In survey research, we can only ask so much of the respondents. And my experience is that we ask them to go back to a further point in time, say back 60 days or 90 days. That would require them to enter quite a few more transactions, and the quality of that data would be compromised. So we picked 30 days as a reasonable starting off point. Also, and I think this is very important, many people view their interactions with financial transactions on a monthly basis. We pay our monthly phone bill or a monthly mortgage bill. So that frame of timing is appropriate in my judgment.
So let's take a look at the actual hypothetical scenario that you used. Can you describe the scenario that you designed?
Absolutely. So this will be displayed on the screen for all of the respondents to see, and this is the outcome of this rather extensive process that I just discussed. I'd like to call your attention.
Can you tell me very quickly, what time of the year did you take this?
The survey was administered in January of this year.
So you're talking about, when you're talking about the 30-day period, you're asking them to think about December.
I believe the survey was administered from January, late January, so it would be the last 30-day period. So from whenever they're taking the survey, so I'm taking the survey, say, on January 27th, I would go back 30 days from the 27th. So that could go in December for some respondents. That's correct.
After the holidays.
Correct.
All right, proceed.
So I just want to call your attention to, in this example, in the middle of this screen is a box, and calling this respondent's attention to it. And you can see there's the grounding in their actual experience. In this example, their last 30 days amount was $4.04, as it's an example. And then we try to express the price increase, which is a 5% price increase, in terms they can understand. What would that mean if they were to make those same purchases? So that's one very important part of this scenario. The other important part of the scenario is to establish what's changing in this hypothetical world and what's not changing. So what's changing are the prices of the at-issue purchase products. What's not changing are the prices outside of that App Store environment. Namely, for example, the prices on the Google Play Store for an Android application, or on websites where someone, at least for some applications, may be able to do in-app purchases for a app on a website. So those things are held constant, if you will. And then finally, this whole scenario is designed to evoke a longer run price response, not a transitory price response.
Why do you view this scenario as invoking a long-run or non-transitory price increase?
Really for three reasons. First of all, if you look at the wording of the scenario, so we say at the very beginning, starting 30 days ago, the Apple App Store increases these prices by 5%. We don't give a termination date, so starting but not finishing. Similarly, when we discuss the external environment, we say the prices remain the same without a termination date. That's one reason. The second reason is, in this scenario, we're actually giving people, we're stating to them that the price of all of these products are going to increase. In the real world, if, for example, Apple were to increase the commission rate, so that would create a price increase, it's unlikely they would announce that to the public. So how would a consumer find out about it or infer about it? They would have to interact with the App Store and notice that prices were increasing not just for one product or two products, but for all across the board. And so that would take them some time. So that's the second reason why this is designed for a longer run price response. And the other that I always should recognize, and I think all good survey experts recognize, is that consumers bring their own experience with products into the survey. And in consumer products, price increases are not temporary. They're more long-standing.
So is there a reason you did not include the word permanent somewhere in this scenario?
Yes, that would be, in my judgment, poor survey practice. In other words, you should not include, as part of any part of your survey, ambiguous terms. And the permanent is a very ambiguous term. It means many things, different things to different people.
So let's talk about how you went about implementing this scenario. Can you describe the process from there?
Yes, so we pose the scenario to the respondent. The respondent then gets to see the scenario a second time. That's the screen being displayed now. And then we ask the respondent a series of follow-up questions on how they would react to that scenario. And here you can see there are three alternatives down there in the gray box areas. The first alternative is we ask them, would they make the same purchases that they made in that 30-day period that they were asked to enter their data in. And the first option is, yes, I would make the same purchases. And then, of course, since prices increase, the amount of the spending would have to increase. Those people we call stickers, meaning they're staying with their purchases. And at that point, we require more information from them. They're terminated from the survey.
Can I ask you, how you dealt with the fact that during the holidays, prices are always lower, and in January, prices always go up. Consumers know that. How did you deal with that?
Prices for apps on the App Store or more generally?
More generally.
Yes, I have actually written about that problem about prices being lowered at holiday periods. That I don't think applies to this class of goods. And we're talking about their purchases being entered primarily in the January period, the post-holiday period.
So you don't think that consumers generally have a view that prices increase in January after the holidays of December?
I don't know that applies to this class of products.
And that wasn't my question. My question is, do you think that consumers believe that?
I think for some products they may.
Have you done any research about whether consumers believe that for these products?
No, I have not.
Proceed.
Okay, so the second option there is that they would change their purchases in some way to achieve a lower total spending. Those are people we call decrementers, and then we follow up with them to see how they would achieve that decrement in their spending. So those the questions continue for them. And then finally, as is in good survey practice, we do offer a not sure, so we don't force people to make a decision. If someone says they're not sure, they are terminated at that point from the survey.
Just let me pause and ask a follow-up question on what the court just asked you. In terms of when you were collecting information on actual purchase spending and then presenting that same amount with a 5% increase, does the period or the month of the year that occurred impact the results or your conclusions from the survey?
I don't believe so.
And why not?
Well, because we're talking about a shift in price. We're talking about response to an increase in price, not a level of price from a specific baseline level.
So in terms of, for the individuals that you mentioned would continue on, the individuals who answered that they would change their purchases and spend less, how did the survey then proceed for them?
Yes, then we proceed to the next question, which is really designed to inquire more about how they would change those expenditures. So if we could see the next slide, please. Right, so the next question is really designed to get at, would people shift some of their purchases away to a new device? That's the third option there.
And in terms of this question, question 17, was it important from your perspective to present every possible option that a respondent might have to spend less in this question?
No, the main purpose of this question is to filter out or obtain information about people who would use a new device, and it's not necessary. The other options essentially are distractor options.
So after question 17, what followed? What were you doing in the remainder of the survey?
Yes, so there's two inputs from this survey that bear on a profitability calculation. One is, of course, their overall revenue response. How do they decrement their overall, how they decrement their spending in response to the price increase? And the other is the extent of switching to new devices. So the remainder of questions are designed to elicit that information.
So the first one you mentioned was measuring reductions in spending. How did you go about measuring that?
Yes, if we could look at the next slide, please. That's question 18. And here we reiterate the scenario in the terms that they can understand. And we ask them, you've told us that you would decrement the spending. By how much? And they enter an amount.
Yona, I think I have one more question that will be before a new topic, if I have that 30 seconds.
Need that 2 minutes.
Okay. How did you go about measuring the second part of the profitability analysis, the percentage of switchers?
Well, we asked question 19, which we can say thank you. And the purpose of that is to understand people who are asked 19 are decrementers who have indicated that they would consider shifting purchases to a new device. And we're basically asking them in 19, which kind of device? And the key issues there are, or the key responses, I should say, are the non-iOS, non-iPad, iPhone devices, another tablet or phone.
Let's talk about results. What did the survey show you about how consumers would react to a 5% price increase of at-issue purchases?
Yes, so the total sample size is about 2,600. As I mentioned in question 16, but we did offer the option to say, I'm not sure. So the people who were able to make either a yes or no option there are called deciders. There were about 2,300 of them in the survey. And then the deciders are divided into two groups. Those people who would stick with their same purchases but pay the larger amount, and those who would decrement. And those proportions are about 81% that we are calling stickers and 19% decrementers. That key share of switching, the switchers are the people. Why is that important for a profitability calculation? Is because if I shift out of an iOS device, Apple doesn't receive the stream of profits from that device over its useful lifetime. And the share of switchers is about 1.3% of those deciders. So there are 2,300 or odd deciders, 1.3% switch out of the iOS system, if you will. Overall, spending reduction is about 11%. And some people like to put that into the units of inelasticity, which is a reduction per 1 percentage point price increase. And the elasticity estimate here is about minus 2.2.
Yeah. All right, let's go ahead and take our second break. We'll stand in recess until 1:15. Thank you.
up for a good time. Corona, get that good vibe. Drinking till the sunrise, just like we used to do. Mexico, let's go there. Yeah, sex is slow, I don't care. Where we go as long as I'm there with you. Just like we used to do. Still tired like your friends, what we used to do. I say the feeling's mutual. Distance between us dissolves when I fly over. Pull up, shotgun, sitting wide open. Hop in, tell me how your life been. Used to talk every day till the night's end. Been a year now, I'ma need the whole scoop. You thriving, update me on them goals too. Yeah, I could listen to you forever. Filling up a few of them strong, never let them take us anywhere they plan to. Don't jump the gun, but when we sippin' something, you already know what's up. Lean back, I'll take you where we used to go. We both familiar on what the future holds. Bottoms up for the time that we wasted. A later we got reacquainted. Pour up for a good time. Corona, get that good vibe. Drinking till the sunrise, just like we used to do. Mexico, let's go there. Yeah, sex is slow, I don't care. Where we go as long as I'm there with you. Just like we used to do. You work hard, you need a vacation. I'll take your lifestyle, rearrange it. Put you on a plane with a destination, a white sand. All this funded off a mic stand. My right hand, I'm catering to your life. From the room, see the waves to the shoreline. Skin tan, you blended with the locals. Burn bread on you, something we could toast to. I'll promote you, show you to the universe. Got a couple on reserve, but you was first. Yeah, always have, always will be. You're the only one who gotta know the real me. So lean back, I'll take you where we used to go. From the clouds, you can view the coast. I feel the same for you. I don't even gotta say shit. Later we got reacquainted. Pour up for a good time. Corona, get that good vibe. Drinking till the sunrise, just like we used to do. Mexico, let's go there. Yeah, sex is slow, I don't care. Where we go as long as I'm there with you. Just like we used to do. Usually I put it down and withdraw. You always getting a round of applause. Standing ovation, give me an encore. Yeah, I need an encore. Tell me that you coming home with me. Love it when you fitting close to me. Who's showing you how it's supposed to be? I know you know it's me. Pour up for a good time. Corona, get that good vibe. Drinking till the sunrise, just like we used to do. Mexico, let's go there. Yeah, sex is slow, I don't care. Where we go as long as I'm there with you. Just like we used to do.
I don't fall in love cause I end up getting fucked. And the scar's too deep, so I ran all out of trust. And you say you ride or die, yeah. So what happened to us? I just kept on getting hurt, so I stopped giving a fuck. I don't fall in love cause I end up getting fucked. And the scar's too deep, so I ran all out of trust. And you say you ride or die, yeah. So what happened to us? I just kept on getting hurt, so I stopped giving a fuck. You was fucking with my head, now I'm crying in the Benz. I'll be better off alone cause I push away my friends. Every time I get a bag, I just blow it on the chems. Cause the gas ain't free, yeah, I still gotta spend. You say you killed for me, now I know it's just a lie. You gon' fuck up on my whip cause you not no ride or die. I need some real homies, niggas that gon' keep me on my grind. It's hard for me to open up, fuck I really don't know why. And the drugs not me, but it keeps me on my shit. Got the ADHD, put an Addy in my lip. Shawty wanna link with us, send the Addy in the zip.
advised them that the prices of the in-app purchases and subscriptions would be increasing, but we didn't
also
the downloads.
you also didn't do any comparison in terms of their spending habits with respect to downloads versus subscriptions or IAPs.
Spending habits? No, I just looked at these documents and allowed me to assess the magnitude of that spending.
And you also, I take it, didn't do any inquiry into the nature of the IAPs for which they had subscriptions.
No, we consider the IAPs and subscriptions as a class, all products simultaneously.
All right. Anything on those questions? Ms. Moskowitz?
No, Your Honor. No.
All right. You're excused, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Witnesses stepping down, I just wanted to mention that in your binder you do have Professor Rossi's report, which is PX 2885, and Appendix F, G, and H do contain the information that Professor Rossi was referring to, but we will move those into evidence.
Okay, thank you.
Your Honor, Justin Clark on behalf of Epic Games. Epic would like to call Professor James Nickens. And we do have a binder containing some demonstratives and a copy of his written testimony.
All right, thank you.
I do. Professor Nickens, could you state your full name and spell your last name for the court?
Yes. My full name is James Williamson Nickens, and my last name is spelled Mickens.
Good afternoon, sir. So, yeah.
Can you hear me now?
That's better. We wanted to come in under the mic. So, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Professor Nickens, what is your occupation?
My current occupation is a professor of computer science at Harvard University.
And Professor Nickens, which subjects do you teach at Harvard?
I teach an undergraduate level course on operating systems, and then I teach a graduate level course on computer security.
Could you provide the court with a brief summary of your educational background, Professor Nickens?
Sure. I got my undergraduate degree from Georgia Tech, where I got a bachelor's degree in computer science, and then I went to get a PhD in computer science at the University of Michigan.
And Professor Nickens, what did you do before teaching at Harvard?
Before I got to Harvard, I was a researcher at Microsoft Research in Redmond, Washington. I worked in the distributed systems group, and then during that time period, I also had a stint as a visiting professor at MIT in the parallel and distributed operating systems group.
Professor Nickens, have you ever been an expert witness in litigation before?
I have not.
What experience do you have in the area of mobile device security?
I have performed a variety of research projects in that area. For example, looking at secure ways to expose mobile sensors like cameras and accelerometers to applications. I have also supervised a variety of student research projects on that topic, and I reviewed a variety of papers on iOS security for the top conferences in my field.
Your Honor, I understand that this might not be necessary, but I'd like to offer Professor Mickens as an expert.
He's admitted. I'm now beginning to get in some of the questioning, understand why antitrust lawyers offer them, so that when they sit on the stand again, they can say, have you ever been admitted? And then they can say affirmatively, yes. Typically, when trial lawyers don't offer them, it's because they don't want the jury they don't want the jury to have my imprimatur on it, and so they don't ask. That's why I say it's not necessary. But I now understand why antitrust lawyers do it. Proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Professor Mickens, when were you employed at Microsoft?
I was employed starting in 2008, and I stopped working there in 2015.
And did you have oversight responsibility for anybody during your time at Microsoft?
The only people who reported to me directly were summer research interns. These were graduate students who came to Microsoft to perform research under my direction.
Have you had any affiliation with Microsoft since the time you left the company in 2015?
I have been invited to serve as a panelist in several iterations of a mentoring conference that Microsoft holds for PhD students who have received a Microsoft PhD fellowship. I was also in 2018 invited to something known as a research faculty summit. Basically, Microsoft invites a variety of professors from different institutions to come to Microsoft to talk about their own research and share some of the research that Microsoft is doing.
Do you have any ongoing relationships with anyone from Microsoft today?
None other than a research collaboration that I currently have with a researcher in Microsoft's New York lab.
Does that research collaboration relate to mobile device security?
It does not.
Professor Mickens, could you please explain your assignment in this case?
Certainly. I was asked to evaluate the security of iPhones as it relates to the App Store, and more generally as the security of the platform relates to various channels of distribution for applications that arrive on an iPhone.
And did you submit an opening written direct testimony in this case?
I did.
Who wrote that testimony?
I wrote that testimony solely myself.
Does that appear at tab 1 of the binder that you have in front of you, labeled Exhibit Expert 5?
Yes, I believe that it does.
Does that appear to be a true and correct copy of the testimony that you wrote?
It does appear to be so, yes.
So, Your Honor, subject to the same understanding with the other written testimony, we would offer that for admission.
It is provisionally admitted as with the others.
Thank you. Professor Mickens, what materials did you rely on to formulate your opinions in this case?
I relied on several different sources. I first of all relied on academic articles about computer security that were submitted to conferences considered reputable in my field. I also relied on public-facing documentation that Apple provides about its products. I relied on the work of reverse engineers who have analyzed how Apple's products work. In particular, I looked at a book written by Jonathan Levin, considered one of the experts in reverse engineering, to understand his analyses. I also looked at articles in the popular press, which talked about various aspects of computer security. And finally, I relied on my own expertise and research and training in the field of operating systems and security.
Professor Mickens, are the sources that you listed the types of sources that you typically rely on in your academic work?
They are. Both myself and other academics in the field of computer security and operating systems oftentimes cite or rely on evidence from the various sources that I just described.
And Professor Mickens, could you give a high-level summary of the conclusions that you reached in connection with your assignment in this case?
Yes. So high-level summary of my conclusions is shown in this demonstrative. And my conclusions are 4 in number. So first of all, I found that if you look at the security properties that an iPhone provides to its users, then those security properties are mainly enforced by the operating system, which in this case is iOS. And so what this means, as listed in my sort of second summary of conclusion bullet, is that when we look at the benefit that the app review provides? Well, that app review actually provides minimal additional security benefits compared to the security benefits that an OS alone could provide. And so what that means sort of in layperson's terms is that the safety of your experience on an iPhone is largely guaranteed by iOS, not by the app review process. Now, the third conclusion that I came to is that if you look at iOS as it's currently designed today, iOS is already capable of installing applications that didn't come from the centrally managed Apple App Store. And this is true both of iOS and of macOS, another Apple-designed operating system. And my fourth high-level conclusion is that if iPhones were indeed opened up to third-party distribution channels, in other words, if third-party app stores were allowed on the iPhone, then that would not result in users of the iPhone suffering from a meaningfully less secure experience on those devices.
Professor Mickens, could you explain at a high level what you mean when you use the term security?
Yes. If we go to the next demonstrative, then what we see here is a sort of 30,000-foot view of the various security mechanisms that an iPhone uses to protect users. At a high level, we can break these individual mechanisms into three categories. At the bottom, we see security mechanisms that are enforced via on-device hardware. And by hardware, I just mean components that are physical in nature, like the touch screen, like the CPU, like memory, so on and so forth. And so at the very bottom, we see hardware-based security mechanisms, for example, involving biometric authentication. How does the phone deal with fingerprint scan data, for example? Now, if we look at that middle row is labeled on-device security mechanisms that are enforced by the operating system. And just to be clear, when I say on-device, I mean the actual device that the user uses, like the actual iPhone, for example. Now, in my opinion, it's that middle layer of security mechanisms, the ones enforced by the on-device operating system, that are the most important. And the reason is that the operating system is responsible for configuring or managing many of these security properties provided by the hardware level. And furthermore, there are security properties that the operating itself is really uniquely situated to provide. So that middle layer, in my opinion, is the most important layer with respect to security.
Do you have an opinion as to why the Android has more security issues than the iPhone?
So this may come up throughout the direct and the cross. My opinion is that if you look at various commodity operating systems, so for example, like iOS or Android, I believe that they're in the same rough equivalence class when it comes to susceptibility to malware, viruses, or things like that.
So you don't think there's a difference between the two devices in terms of security?
I don't think there's a meaningful difference. Now, that's a bit subtle. You know, what do I mean by meaningful? Why am I qualifying it like that? Because I think that at the margins, for example, we could identify certain specific types of malware that might only affect iOS versus, let's say, Android. But if we look sort of holistically at the big picture of security, then I think that these two platforms are roughly equivalent in terms of their security properties.
Okay.
Thank you.
So Professor Mickens, I think that you explained to us the two bottom layers of the demonstrative that we're looking at here. What is the top layer showing?
Yes, sir. Well, what the top level shows, this is sort of the third tier of security enforcement on an iPhone. And I call this tier off-device security that is related to app distribution. In other words, the mechanisms by which an application is reviewed, if at all, and the mechanisms by which developers are registered, if at all, with some central authority, and the extent to which applications are signed. We'll probably go into this in more detail during the rest of my testimony, but what are signatures? What does that mean? Well, a signature connotes attribution and integrity. It basically tells you where a particular piece of digital content, where it came from. That's the attribution part. And then it also tells you has that content been tampered with by some external party in a way that the original signing authority would not have liked. So those are the three layers of security on an iPhone.
So, Professor Mickens, you testified that you believe that the operating system is the most important security layer. Could you just give us a very high-level summary of how an operating system works?
Sure. So if we go to the next demonstrative, then here we see what I think is a helpful analogy for understanding how an operating system works. So first, before we think about operating system, let's first think about going to a restaurant, okay, something you're all fond of doing back in the pre-time. So if you go to a restaurant, let's say that you're a customer and you want to get something to eat. So in most restaurants, you as the customer can't just go to the kitchen and start preparing the meal yourself. Instead, there's a chef who is the executive, if you will. It's the chef who ultimately controls how the ovens work, how the ingredients are combined, which ingredients are used, so on and so forth. And so the chef is the executive of the kitchen. Now, in most restaurants, though, you as a customer can't just directly ask the chef to do things. Instead, there's wait staff, people who sit in between you as the customer and the chef. And so you have these levels of intermediation. So even though the chef is the ultimate controller of what happens in the kitchen, by having that wait staff layer, we essentially allow the chef to focus on the lowest level task of running the kitchen. Whereas we can defer the work of customer service and showing people menus. That can all be deferred to the wait staff. So that's the way a restaurant works. Ultimately, customers want to interact with the kitchen, but to do so, they have to go through several intermediate layers. Now, if we look on the right-hand side of that demonstrative, what we see is the organizational structure for a computing device. So, for example, like a desktop, a laptop, or in fact, like an iPhone. So what we see is that at the lowest level, we have the hardware that's associated with that device. The physical components, once again, like the CPU, like the touchscreen, so on and so forth. So apps are all the way up at the top. Apps are the things that users interact with, the things that they download, they install, that they see on their home screen. Now, ultimately, those apps want to interact with the hardware to do things like send network data, read or write from a storage device, interact with other apps. However, much like in a restaurant, how a customer can't directly do things in the kitchen, on a computing device, the apps can't directly manipulate the hardware. That's what the operating system is responsible for. And so the operating system, that's what we see in those two middle layers. And so at the lowest layer of the operating system, we see the kernel. That's analogous to the chef in a restaurant. That's the ultimate determinant of what happens on the machine, what happens in the hardware. But then above the kernel, we have this thing called middleware. And by way of analogy, you can think of middleware as being analogous to the wait staff. So oftentimes when an application wants to do something on the phone, it doesn't just talk to the kernel directly. Instead, it sends a request to the middleware. The middleware might do some initial processing of that request, send it to the kernel. The kernel then decides whether or not to fulfill that request, and if so, how.
Professor Mickens, the court has heard some testimony this week from economists who discussed the term middleware as a particular type of cross-platform software. Is that what you're referring to when you talk about middleware in your testimony?
Not quite. So the word middleware is used in a variety of contexts in computer science and can be a bit confusing to understand which one is being used, which context. So here I specifically mean software that has been written by the OS vendor to assist with the operation of the operating system's kernel.
And Professor Mickens, why is it that you believe the operating system is the most important security layer?
The reason why I believe that it's the most important security layer is because when we think about what makes an application malicious or benevolent, well, those distinctions are client-side distinctions. Now, that word may come up a couple of times throughout my testimony in the cross. What I mean by client-side is simply the device that the user uses. And I use the word client-side to distinguish from the server side. So, for example, there's a computer run by Apple or someone else, maybe somewhere in the cloud doing analyses over there. That's what server-side means versus client-side, which is just what's happening on the user device. So when we look at the notion of what makes an app malicious, what makes a program malware, for example, that's a behavioral definition. We're saying that malware is bad because it tries to do bad things. And so those attempts at doing bad things are all happening on the